So thank you very much, everybody, for joining this session today. I'm going to make a quick introduction to the No Code Lab. We're a new community here in the UK. My name's Zandra. I'm the CEO of Panintelligence. We're a data analytics provider and software developer in Leeds. All of our team are based here, and the No Code Lab was an initiative born out of the experiences of we as a business were finding working with the community in trying to enable a more rapid acceleration of digital adoption and solving some of the real world problems through technologies that required less coding, in fact no coding in many cases. So I'm trying to bring that community together and crack that kind of change around digital adoption. So we are a community of like-minded individuals and enthusiasts. We are trying to open this conversation around no code, low code, trying to demystify it a bit, help people to understand what we mean by that, and also enable that conversation to turn into action. So we're really about developing solutions, not just having great discussions like we're going to have today, to create some positive outcomes from the adoption of no-code, low-code technologies. So collaboration and partnerships, open idea sharing and projects that we can work together on rapidly. So we do want to make a difference. The world of digital adoption is now moving much more down to the developer and citizen developers, from developers to citizen developers. What I mean by that is we're now seeing this enabling technology, no code and low code enabling technology, giving people without the technical skills the ability to create those solutions for themselves. And this is really enabling to have a rapid deployment of new solutions and new thinking. So today, I'm going to give you a little bit of a short description about what no code and low code means, and then open that up to discussion as part of this wider conversation today on the data strategy. But just for simplification for everybody on this event today, no code is for those local business users. It's technology which can be used to build apps fast without writing a line of code. So really simple kind of building of solutions to problems where you don't need to have a developer or a technical team involved. Low code tends to be for more of the developer. It helps them to simplify and streamline the delivery of solutions. So essentially dropping in technology that already exists to fast track the building and creation of platforms and solutions to problems. So no code and low code is all about speed to solution and problem solving through data and technology. What's this got to do with the national data strategy? Well, we feel that the no code movement could really be at the heart of enabling the data strategy, and that by working with the digital and data sectors together, we can create more accessible, democratized solutions which actually unlock the value of that data asset that we have in our wider society. So really today is about opening that conversation about the data strategy at the heart of the digital community as part of Leeds Digital Festival, and with these people in the room really to talk about some of the key areas that data strategy and digital strategy could support. 3 areas we're going to be covering today in our discussion is how we bridge the skills gap, the data and digital skills gap in order to enable the data strategy, how we can accelerate innovation and speed of change of solutions through digital and data strategies, and how the government's digital and data strategies can be better aligned. So what are the things we can do to enable that? So there are 3 areas that we'll probably dig into. But before we do go into the conversation, I'm really keen that we hear from Phil, because Phil's got some slides to share with us to give us the context around the data strategy, what its objectives are and what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to fumble around a little bit with my technology. I'm going to now give Phil permission to share, so just bear with me 1 second whilst I do that, and I bring my colleagues up on the screen.
That's great, thank you very much. Hello everybody, great to be here. I'd say great to be here in Leeds. It would be nice to say I was getting out of London, but obviously we're all sort of in our virtual space, but great to be here nonetheless. So as Zandra said, really, we're here to have a conversation, and I think it's worth saying at the outset that the national data strategy is very much designed with that in mind. We've written it not to be the final answer on what government is doing to solve the data problem or to unlock the power of data in and of itself. It's very much designed as a framework, which is exactly as we're doing today, really, to provide the basis for a conversation. So I'm really up for having that. Really interested to hear your sort of perspectives on it. I'll be quite honest. I haven't really thought about all of this in the context of low code, no code, but I find it really exciting and a really kind of interesting lens to look at it through. Because again, it's worth sort of saying at the outset, I don't come to this as a data expert or a data professional, particularly. I've got lots of people in my teams who are, and I've been keen that this should be a strategy for people who aren't necessarily kind of experts in data or coding or anything else. This needs to be something that really helps to unlock the power of data for everyone in a way which means something to everybody. So hopefully I'll be able to draw that out a little bit. I'll try and keep this relatively short because obviously it would be good to then leave some space to have the conversation around that. So I'm going to start with a little bit of context in terms of where the strategies come from, then spend the most time actually on what's in it, and then finally just very briefly just touch on the next steps. Thank you. So this slide really just illustrates that the National Data Strategy has been relatively long in its gestation. It was originally foreseen and commissioned by Matt Hancock. You've seen him a lot recently, but at the time he was the DCMS Secretary of State back in June 2018. And since then, last year, the team delivered a public-facing call for evidence, undertook a round of stakeholder engagement, and that was very much something which fed into the shaping of the strategy. And then what we've then done, as we've seen, is published the strategy and the framework on the 9th of September, so 2 or 3 weeks ago now. And as I say, that's very much in the vein of opening up a consultation and a conversation around this. The timing is interesting insofar as whenever we would have published this, it would have been relevant, it would have been important. I think the fact that we do so in the midst of working remotely, many of us, and in more generally responding to the COVID crisis, that has really, I think, demonstrated the power of data. So I think it definitely gives increased relevance, certainly from our perspective, around some of this. But equally, we're keen that this isn't just a strategy which is about using data to respond to COVID. It's something which goes far beyond that, and it's something which is about underpinning economic growth into the longer run. So moving now on to the NDS itself and actually what's in there. So really just to start with the purpose, why is it that we've set out this strategy? So we hope that it operates on a number of levels, essentially. At the top level, what we're trying to do here is set out a high level of ambition for how we can use data both to drive economic growth and transform public services, positioning the UK as a leader in this space. Building on that vision, we try to articulate a narrative which is very much about, as you said, an ambitious pro-growth narrative, and the data should support that rather than growth and responsible data use in conflict. We feel that they are some things that can be mutually supportive. But then it's not just about having a good story to tell. What we then try and do with the strategy is set out a framework for policy initiatives that we will take forward, and then, as it says there, actual commitments to action, which we'd like everyone to hold us to, and we focus on the delivery of 5 priority missions, which are the areas where we think action can have the greatest impact, and I'll go on to talk about those in a moment. So in terms of how we structure the strategy, we start off by trying to articulate the opportunity, which falls in a number of areas. Some of these I've already sort of alluded to already, but we feel that data has the power to support all of these, boosting productivity in trade, supporting new businesses and jobs, which I think is very relevant to this discussion, increasing the speed and efficiency of research, particularly within government, driving better delivery of policy outcomes by better tailoring and targeting of policies. And finally, and definitely not least importantly, using data to create a fairer society by using data to sort of tackle bias rather than entrenching some of the biases that might already exist in society. So if that's kind of the opportunity that's out there to be grasped through all of this, what we then go on to on the next slide is so we call these our pillars. These are sort of the areas where we think, in order to deliver that opportunity, these are the areas where we think we need to get things right. And we see 4 pillars here, and good to get people's thoughts on whether these look right. The first is around data foundations, which is really ensuring that data is fit for purpose. Traditionally, people might think about data standards, governance, having those kind of things in place in order to make sure that your data is kind of in the right state to start with. What you then need to support that is a set of skills, because so by having the data, we haven't got the people with the right capabilities to be able to understand how that data can be used effectively. Thirdly, availability. So this is the idea that as well as having the data and having the skills to use it, we need to actually get at it and be able to move it to the right places to ensure you can unlock that value. But then with all of that, the 4th pillar is then responsibility, because with all that data moving around, that needs to be done on a basis in which that data is trusted and the use of that data is trusted, which includes around high data protection standards, but there's a whole load of other things that come around that as well to ensure that data can be used responsibly. So that's sort of our broad framework. What we then go on to on the next slide are our 5 priority missions, as I mentioned before. So the first one there is around, as it says, unlocking the value of data across the economy. This is possibly the one which is the sort of the least well formed insofar as this is something that we've heard loud and clear through our previous consultation, that this is something that people want to see. What's less clear is exactly what the role of government should be in doing this. So this is really saying we want people to be able to use that data effectively in the economy. What are the things that government can do to help break down those barriers and make that happen? So very kind of interested in any thoughts on that. The second mission is around making sure that we create the right legislative regime which supports growth and supports businesses. Obviously, at the moment, we have a regime which is largely driven by the EU approach of the GDPR, and then we have the Domestic Data Protection Act, which gives effect to that. Obviously, we are keen to build on that to ensure that we have a regime which is the best that it can be. The third mission is around government's own use of data and getting our house in order and making sure that we are doing the best that we can do within government to use shared data effectively to have positive outcome on public services. The fourth mission is less about the data and more on what underpins it, so the data infrastructure, by which we mean things like the data centres and the networks which actually support that movement of data, and ensuring that we have the security and resilience around those things to ensure that all this stuff can continue to happen. And then final mission there is around the international flow of data, because this isn't just about acting domestically, this is about thinking about how we can ensure that data is moving around across borders to deliver the sorts of outcomes that we want to see. So that's kind of the strategy in a nutshell. That there is just basically a picture which hopefully summarises everything that I've just said. Where do we go from here? As I say, this is all set out as a consultation. We have a series of questions that sit alongside the strategy, asking firstly about that overall frame that I just described there, but then there are a series of detailed questions around those specific missions and the proposed areas of focus. So I'm hoping that if I stimulate you a little bit in this conversation, you might then feel enthusiastic enough to then go away and think about responding to that consultation. We'd be very pleased to hear from you. We are thinking towards a follow-up publication of some kind, which will incorporate whatever it is that we learn and glean through that consultation process. We're also keen, as I say, that this isn't just a strategy that sits on the shelf, but this becomes a set of actions or a framework which drives those actions, and those will need monitoring and evaluation to ensure that those things actually happen, and then we'll put some obviously governance around that. And we're actually thinking about how we continue to engage people outside of government in this as it continues to develop, because we don't want this just to be a strategy for government. We want this to be a national data strategy which people can buy into, which can genuinely help to deliver change in the real world. So that was a relatively quick canter through, but hopefully that gives a bit of a frame for how we've approached the strategy and what we want it to be. Really keen to get your thoughts.
Brilliant, thank you, Phil. It was fantastic, and it was good to get an overview. I had the opportunity to complete the consultation document. You're right, there's a lot more detail in the questions that are asked across all of those pillars, and I think it's an opportunity for us all to have that conversation today, but I think also encouraging those that are on call today to go and have their say through the consultation document. So I just a bit of summary really. I think the opportunity is evident. I mean, I was on a round table only yesterday where we were talking about productivity and the productivity puzzle where the UK is lagging since 2008 on productivity, and that digital and data is seen as an opportunity to kind of bring us back up to the level of productivity that we had. So nice to see that productivity is top of your opportunity list there, really. New business job creation, speed of research capabilities, creating a fairer society. I think they're all things that we will cover in our conversations today. But I wanted to start with one of the four core areas in data and skills, if I may, and just maybe open that conversation out to everybody. And I think the first question to the panellists are, really, what do you see as the priorities for skills and knowledge gaps, diversity or technical capability, as what are those and what should we be thinking about in order to address part of these pillars identified by the National Data Strategy. And what I won't do is I won't necessarily go around person to person, and if you want to just raise your hand or jump in, and then we'll have a close conversation. Over to you.
Quite happy to kick off. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Zandra, for chairing the session. And for Phil, that was such a good run-through of what is quite a large, comprehensive document. There's a lot in there, so thank you so much for running us through the document. And I share Zandra's call. Go and, perhaps not right now, but go and look at the document because there's a lot more in there, and particularly around this issue of skills. So we know that as an industry, as a data industry, we're creating more jobs than we can fill, and we know for some time that even when I started this role at techUK, we were talking about the data scientist gap that we have in the UK. As the conversation has evolved around machine learning and artificial intelligence and the power of those technologies in the UK, we've talked about, and the UK's AI review led by Dame Wendy Hall and Jerome Vicenti highlighted that getting the AI skills gap right for the UK is important for our AI future, making the UK AI ready. And it all comes back down to data and the importance of getting the people that we need in the ecosystem, in the industry, with the skills that we need, not only to realize the potential of data, but to help organizations to do that as well. And I think there's still a lot we need to do to make sure that we can make sure the industry has the right skills, the right data professionals that we will need as data becomes more and more important to every sector, every business, every organisation across the whole of the UK. But I think there's also another part of that skills conversation, which I think the strategy does touch on in terms of businesses and organisations understanding themselves about data and what role data can play. So yes, it's about the people that've got the technical skills, and yes, it's about people that can understand what data means. But it's making sure organisations understand, and maybe at that management level as well, about how they can use or better use the data and what that could mean for their business. And we need to make sure that while we address, I think, the technical skills gaps, we need to think about the kind of other types of skills, data skills that organisations and people need to make sure that every organisation has the same opportunity in this area. So I think even in the skills, we could have a whole panel, right, just on the skills aspect of the data strategy itself. There's a lot to unpack, but I think the strategy gives us an opportunity to really get into the weeds of this conversation and look at how we can really position the UK well in this area.
Thanks, Sue. And I think with Danny and Dennis, Dennis sort of operate in different segments of this. I think this is really appropriate, Danny. I know BJS run a whole range of programs that are upskilling those people that we need to bridge through that gap. And maybe if we could start with you, and then Dennis perhaps thinking a little bit about that wider education piece in actually educating business into sort of data and data principles. Danny, into you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think the opportunity and where we are, I know we talk about the next industrial revolution, and we're absolutely aren't we? And it's incredible to all of us. And I mean, just in prep for this, I was just looking at some data actually, and the number of organisations with more than 100 terabytes of unstructured data has doubled since 2016. I mean, that's just those numbers. I don't know where to begin with. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? And we see that with our customers. I mean, from a BJSS perspective, I mean, we work heavily in the public and private sectors. We can see both sides, but absolutely, we're if you like, a hardcore software shop. We're all born from with the glow of green screens in our face and dark and rooms. That cliche. But we absolutely get that can't continue anymore. The skills gap is growing all the time, as you said, Sue. So we've got a number of activities going on. One, probably first and foremost, is our academy, and we know that we have to take people from different backgrounds, culturally, from different, just a whole diverse collection of people who necessarily aren't going to be our kind of best support corporate. For them, is going to be not going to be necessarily BJSS. So building an academy where we can explain to them that these challenges and where we sit today, where the world is going, the million plus developer shortfall that's just growing and growing. I was looking at some other data that I just thought was amazing as well. 37% of organisations still use paper for critical business processes. And what does that mean to data? So this 100 terabytes is probably just the tip of the iceberg. And as Sue already said, we absolutely on the front of AI, machine learning, how we can bring people into that world, because it's incredibly daunting to a young person today. If you show them, or try and explain to them machine learning, data science, modelling, I think they may have questions. They may scare them off, and hopefully today, I'm sure today we'll talk a little bit more about what low code can do in that space. I know, Zandra, you've alluded to that already in terms of some of the abstractions that are available, some of the things that we can kind of show people that are far less scary. Sit in front of a browser and build something quickly that shows some real benefit. And I guess that's what we're trying to do in BJSS, certainly through our academy. And interestingly, of course, we have to show our customers that as well, because they're sitting on these gold mines of data. They're often traditionally siloed in their mindset and in their data, trying to explain to them that kind of the world's moved on, if you like, and it's time to think about your data in a different way, really. So, I think it's incredible. It's an incredible time as well.
I think you made a really great point there, Danny, about language as well, and the use of language in bridging that gap, language gap and skills gap, but also technology being part of that language. So, being a way to actually demystify, simplify some of these concepts to make them more accessible. There's so many areas of this that we could deep dive into, but there's something in the data strategy that I think is addressing also regional inequalities. How do we make sure that part of this conversation today is to make sure all the voices are at the table as part of it. But how do you think we can take it down? It's just thinking about your role and how do we bring the regional variation of capabilities or challenges that need to be addressed in that down? Where would you see that playing?
So I think one of the major benefits of looking at a regional level, so data has the characteristics very often, especially big data, that you can be more timely, you can be more micro level, and you can create international benchmarking possibilities, which means that you can compare one city with a methodology to another city. And what identifies the cities or regions is, of course, its own culture and its own kind of specificities that you need to examine. And I think, and it's what I see when working with both the academics and the local businesses, is that they understand the region. They give you the reasons why they're located there. They very often work with regional data and kind of these different data sources, these kind of why questions will help you identify the parameters to set up a local monitor, and it will really kind of spark the data-driven policy making by creating this cluster where not just academics are working in, but where you create a kind of a panel open to scrutiny, where there's universities in there, there's local government involved, and there's kind of charities, local businesses that all are able to give input in what kind of sources are relevant and what kind of methodology can be created in order to monitor it. But you need these specific parties in order to identify a specific region, because coming from the Netherlands and already having spent time in London, Birmingham, and Leeds, those cities are not comparable in terms of culture. There's a definite difference, and that's how you should approach it as well.
That's a really great reply, Dennis. I think there's a whole subject area there around, how regional influence and control over these sort of localized data strategies, enabling to sort of take away some of those problems around perhaps bias or the missing perhaps characteristics that need to be attributed to those based on regional variations. I think it's a fascinating discussion. We'll probably have to move on, unfortunately. But so I think that's a good start on skills, albeit I don't think we've even scratched the surface, if I'm being honest with you. So Phil, I wish we had all day, but we don't. I was just going to move on to some of the other pillars, those new business and job creation, this productivity and the acceleration of innovation, because there is absolutely clearly defined in the data strategy the opportunity for the sort of untapped potential of data that already exists in the hands of many organisations and institutions, and what are the ways we can unlock that quickly? How do we create that speed of change, especially now we're in this this crisis moment where I think we've seen some really good examples of best practice and innovation around that. So perhaps if we could start there and just think about some good examples of things that we have seen during this period as individuals, where we've seen a really great acceleration of digital and data combined solutions that have been able to address some of these societal challenges. I wonder if you wanted to share an example to start. Infrastructure and technology that's already in the city and installed, but using low-code data and form-based technologies to be able to turn that rapidly into a new application, new use case for existing technology. So I think we can use the strength of the governance and the infrastructure of existing platforms, but plugging in low-code solutions to unlock that, I think is a of that I've seen. But Sue, Dennis, you had any other sort of examples of these kind of applications, not necessarily COVID related?
Yeah, I was about to say that to touch on another key element of the data strategy is the data infrastructure, the digital and data infrastructure, which is great to see that's part of the strategy as well, and looking at how we get that right. And I think we are all well aware, or more aware perhaps now, of how important that infrastructure is, given what we have been working through and what we're even doing right now, and making sure that we can be digitally connected while we're physically apart. That infrastructure has played a key role throughout COVID, and as we all know, data is front and centre now in terms of a lot of people's minds around what data means to them and what role data plays in particular decision making about people in their lives, whether it's at work or whether it's part of government response to COVID, or whether it's in your local communities, as you say, Zandra, where things may be reopening and things may be unlocking again. So it's really important. A good example I heard about, which I think is great, is a bit more in, I suppose, our own personal lives. So, this is Ocado. This is an example from Ocado. So Ocado were looking at how that they can use data analytics and data technologies to understand how they could optimize their delivery service during the COVID crisis, particularly in the early days. So if you're a customer of Ocado, how can Ocado make sure that they can get to all the customers that need it, particularly the people that are really at the beginning that needed it? That created more space in their delivery vans which meant they could put more groceries in, which meant they could deliver more groceries to people a week. I think it was something like 6,000 more a week. It's in the case study and I'll share it. Just that small, and again, no human had thought of that, but using data analytics and AI, it come up with that solution that actually had a direct impact on those customers and meant that people who needed groceries when we all went into lockdown were able to get them. Now, that's a really powerful example of how data and the use of data analytics and data technologies can really make a difference to people's lives. And I think that's just as it's important to driving productivity and economic growth, and absolutely completely, or whether it's helping data and using data technologies to create new ventilator technologies, which we saw as well, right? People working together, sharing data, opening up more data, using APIs to share that data to address a really specific problem. Those examples really bring to life what data can really do, and therefore how it's important that we get this next, the strategy right and how we take the strategy forward. I just will be quiet there because I'm on my soapbox, but I just wanted to touch base on the conversation before. It's really vital that we have this conversation across the whole of the UK, which is why techUK were thrilled to sponsor with the No Code Lab on this event as part of the Digital Leeds Festival. It's vital, right, that we talk about what this means, not just for the UK, but what this means for every region and every part of the UK. And in fact, we will be announcing soon that we're going to have a similar conversation at the Birmingham Tech Week coming up. So we're really, really keen to make sure that we get as many voices part of this discussion and getting this right. And that includes, Zandra, of course, looking at all the different technologies that can play a role here. And I think, again, the National Data Strategy is very technology neutral. It's not looking at specific technologies, and that's exactly the way we need to go, because different technologies will have different purposes here. But I think, as well as looking at these big core missions, which are absolutely key, I think a big, and perhaps we'll come on to this, Sandra, a big key element of the strategy for me is getting those data foundations right, getting the data availability, getting the data skills, getting the data resilience right as well. That's really got to be, I suppose, our foundation on which to therefore build on as well.
All please. I wondered if anybody wanted to say anything else on this kind of speed of innovation acceleration, and what are the other enabling factors? Because I think there is something about the foundations too that we need to come on to, and I think that we'll move on to that point. Is there anything else that Dennis, you others want to share?
I completely agree with Sue, and I think it's really about finding safe ways of combining, especially vertically partitioned data. So it is about taking this multitude of different data sources that we haven't been able to combine previously, that we're now finding ways of, okay, how can we see this? How can we combine this? And I think creating the infrastructure for that, setting up a framework in order to create kind of these clouds where we can do that, should be very much encouraged. So, by using multi-party computation, or I believe very strongly in democratization of data, so I feel very strongly in self-sovereign identity, and then using basically distributed ledgers, it creates this kind of playground where you can very quickly, very efficiently set up kind of these sandboxes where you can work together with an interdisciplinary team, where you can exchange, where you can work with the data without actually sharing the data, which sounds very contradictory, but through these kind of different methods, it's very much possible. So, and then it gives the opportunity for looking at and looking at other examples, for instance, supply chain management, infrastructure, building design, air quality monitoring, let alone societal challenge monitors that you can set up on a citywide level. And you'll be spending money up front, but it'll save a lot of money in the back. And I think that's something that we really need to work towards. Yes, it's an investment that you make, but because of that, you'll make more informed decisions. And I think that's the important part of and kind of the answers we get by using data.
And Dennis, you've had a view from different regions and different parts of the world, quite frankly, on this, and I think that's incredibly useful, not just from a regional perspective. I wonder if you've seen things work really well. If you could wave a wand and make something happen, what would it be? What would you replicate in Leeds?
I think one of the most interesting things I saw was research done by the Human Lab from MIT. when I was there last year, and something they did was by using, for instance, app data and other location data, managed to show economic segregation. So they managed to show, based on people's income, where they would gather and where they wouldn't gather. And you would be able to indicate with these samples, for instance, that normal museums would be very well integrated, so everybody would come together.
You know, there are ethical dimensions to this, and governance questions equally. So maybe, Phil, I'd be really interested, actually, I know you're sort of observing and taking notes, but I'd be interested in your perspective on where you think this responsibility is right now, and where perhaps it needs to be moving towards.
Thanks, Zandra. I mean, it's a good question. I think it really sits at the heart of some of the thinking that we've done in drawing up the strategy. And you know, what we say in there is that ultimately we think everyone has a responsibility here. So government clearly has a responsibility to create the right frameworks for people for all this work. We think that to ensure that they are to use the data that they gather responsibly, and to kind of do that in a transparent way, so that people can understand that. But perhaps most importantly, every individual has a responsibility to actually, I mean, kind of going back to the start of this conversation, I think everyone has a responsibility to sort of be up to the point where they can actually make slightly more informed decisions about the way that their data is being used. Because I think we certainly see that some of the potential barriers to the opportunities that we've been talking to today stem from perceptions, essentially, about how data could be used or might be used, or scare stories about this, that, and the other. And so there's a responsibility on government to try and create the right frameworks to generate that trust, and for businesses to then be responsible. But then there's a responsibility for everybody to engage in that and to have to approach it from the perspective of understanding the power that their data actually has, and that can. I think we probably live in a large and naturally sort of risk-averse society where people worry about how their data might be used for bad things. What we're trying to do, partly through the strategy, and we make everyone here sort of spread it, that actually they can do some really good things. And people need to recognise that and realise that indeed can be a force for good, and that they then have a responsibility to think pretty hard about how their data could be used, so that they think twice before maybe opting out of these things. And because, as I say, that data can do some pretty good things. So that's kind of how we're trying to sort of set up the conversation, and that is perhaps a bit of a shift from where the conversation has been in the past. So I guess it's good to kind of understand how that sort of lands within this community, but also how we might try to take that out there, and what we could be doing in practice to help kind of spread that message.
And I know we're having a few sound issues, but hopefully I think everyone got most of that. But thank you. I think that was clear. So yeah, there's the framework by the government, transparency by business, and responsibility by business in how they collect and gather that, but also a better understanding widely by individuals in the potential to use that data, and therefore less concern about how they may allow that data to be used for the benefit of perhaps broader societal gains, I think, is probably a very short summary. But I would be really interested in getting some views on where some of the biggest challenges lie, and what may be some of the approaches we could take. Who'd like to start?
I'll say a few words. I'm coming purely at this really from a software perspective, and I guess I'm just thinking something that resonates, a lot of those words there is what happened with open source and the open source community. And you think about in the past this kind of closed mentality and organisations wanting to own their IP and keep it under lock and key and be very protective of it, and how we've moved, and especially in government, to completely embrace this idea of open source. And it seems to me like a lot of principles in open source of sharing, of contributing, and absolute transparency and working together all of those things resonate exactly with what we're talking about here and what we expect from data in the same way. And I can't help feeling there's these parallels. While they're quite different things, what people want out of them is the same. I want to be able to look under the hood, because of course once you look under the hood, you demystify it. You realise that actually this isn't a Big Brother thing. This is something that does something very specific. And so I can't help thinking that is something, and something I know we've already touched on as well, is this idea, with IoT and this huge influx of huge amounts of data flying around, and ensuring that we know where that data came from, who owns it, where we need to anonymise it. And we worked with a client last year on a solution for in the building sector, where they had loads of IoT sensors and they were generating huge amounts of data. And they realised that actually that data, when anonymised or when given the correct levels of kind of transparency, give other organisations the benefit of their learning. And all of a sudden you've kind of got this open market where people can share data. In this case, this was to control heating and lighting, so absolutely an ecological impact. But traditionally those organisations, in much the same way as open source has made a massive shift in transparency, did the same thing in terms of IoT and data. And I think there's a lot of learnings from there, but it does take organisations, I think, a long time to kind of get on board with this, because they're traditionally going to be very protective. And it's the same with a citizen. I know I'm always wary about who I give my data to. We all are. But suddenly when you realise there's a greater good and that I've got confidence in it, and just very last point, think of public cloud. A few years ago in the public cloud, there was all these questions about security, about where the custodianship, where it lives. And we're past that now. The conversation about public cloud has moved on to, I realise that is a true enabling technology. And it's, again, another parallel in this journey. And maybe where we are with data is just slightly behind that curve, if that makes sense. I guess that's my view, purely from a software perspective, if you like.
So to paraphrase, it's a matter of time, Danny. We're sort of on a natural adoption curve where people at some point in a few years from now will just accept that their technology is there and available to be used for all sorts of purposes, and that it will not be a worry anymore like the public cloud and other things, or open source was for the software industry, right? Okay, hard thing to influence then, Phil. It's just time. But are there things that we can influence? I just wondered what people's views were on influencing the public think or industry. Dennis, you're nodding away.
Yeah, to kind of related to that, I think I wouldn't just say time, because that becomes maybe a little bit too technological deterministic. So and I think it is indeed more co-construction, so indeed it'll take time, but it's because the interactions between public and developing these apps that kind of co-creates each other anyway. And I think what I said before, you don't actually have to exchange data, and it's kind of making people aware that, there are new ways of sharing data without being afraid that actually, it gets out there. So using SSI or MPC with blockchain distributed ledgers will actually help you get a control on, okay, who's using my data and how, but actually it'll always be anonymized. And I think that's important. It's creating that awareness. And I always say data in itself doesn't actively do anything, in the sense that, it's always afterwards what you do. When I would teach at the ministries, what I always would say is, it's kind of a tool that makes a monitor, and politics starts after that. Not prior to that, not during, but after that. Once you have kind of the visualizations ready, or you have the information ready, that's when you can implement something. And therefore, I always believe open methodology is key. Being open for that scrutiny. You can always create artificial data sets in order to test, because reproducibility is important. But then if you're not open about your methodology, it becomes very difficult to kind of see what's going on. Of course, that has its limitations. I mean, if you get a 200 gigabyte data set from Google, and you want to try and run your own machine learning on it, that can take quite a while. And then and if you made a mistake in your code, that becomes a very wary process. But in general, I think that's very important. Democratizing data and getting more and better involvement will be key for people to understand it, to know what they're doing. And, the no-code example is perfect. It shows that people themselves can start playing with it. But I think other things you need to take into account is also the groups that won't be able to join. So the minority I'm looking at, for instance, the elderly, the greying society, who are maybe not that tech savvy. I don't want to create kind of a bias in that sense, but there are people who don't work with technology, or either whether they refuse to or whether they don't want to or can't be bothered. And, these missing users are also very important to take into account. Not everybody will be represented in the data. Not everybody has a mobile phone. And very often these are the people that are, in kind of the underrepresented portions of society. And I think that's also very important. So I always say you use these sort of data sets, big data sets, especially reality monitoring, as they say, to create something, but then I'm trying to identify the missing users and using other methodologies, such as, for instance, surveys, to gather their opinion, their kind of use cases, would be very important. So I think it's more that how can we involve everybody and make everybody aware, and that kind of co-creative ideology will hopefully help.
Dennis's comment of the elderly reminds me of a conversation I had at the weekend where I was trying to explain to my mother, who wouldn't like me calling her elderly, but let's face it, what Spotify was and how you use Spotify, and it not only gave me a slight headache to explain it to her, I had to have a glass of wine afterwards, but absolutely, so we need to make this inclusive, right? And that's not, there's no silver bullet, that's not an easy thing to do, is it? That's not an easy thing to get right, but something we have to, given the increasing role that digital data is playing in decisions that are being made about people's lives. I think to the point about time, and Danny's point about time, it makes me sit here and wonder, well, what makes, we've been talking about this for quite some time. I've been in this industry quite some time. We've been talking about big data analytics, how we use data more. What makes now different? Does it feel different now in terms of the time that we're in now? And I think this conversation has highlighted that. I think it is, because perhaps now we have the technologies, to Danny's point, we have the cloud infrastructure, we have the cloud adoption and take up, yes, very much increased. Even if we look at 2016 to now, the use of cloud is just, continuing to increase. Still a lot of people that aren't, so there's still a lot to do there. But we now have the cloud infrastructure, we now have the open source, we have the APIs, we have the technologies. Perhaps now we have the tools that we need to really realize the potential where perhaps we didn't in the past. That's not to say that there still aren't some really big questions to deal with. So one of them, ones that's I think touched on in the strategy, is data quality. If we're going to rely on the data, if we're going to use the data that is already collected and already exists, how do we make sure, particularly to make really big decisions, whether it's policy making or from a business point of view, how do we make sure that data quality is right and is good? And who decides what's good? And to the question in the chat about bias, how do we address issues in historical data and data that exists particularly around bias? I think also what makes now different, and to Zandra, your question about responsibility, is we do have a regulatory and legal framework around data protection, data privacy, which is very I was about to say very new, but it is relatively new in terms of laws we've had in the past. 2 years been implemented into the GDPR and the Data Protection Act. It provides that legal framework. It provides that certainty as to what organisations, what people can do around data, and where responsibility and accountability and transparency lies. It provides you that framework. But I always say GDPR is the floor, not the ceiling. It's a starting point. There is more you can do. And I think the conversation we're having now around data and data's role in all our lives, which I think the strategy again touches on, Phil, in terms of that fairer society point, is around, it's not just answering questions around data protection, data privacy law, it's looking at those wider issues. It's looking at the impact of data on people's everyday lives. What the law allows, and yes, what the law, but also what's the sense of feeling around people? What's the ethical issues? What's the societal issues? What's the wider issues that a data-driven society and economy could raise now and as we go forward? And I think the UK is in a good place to have that conversation. We have, the Centre for Ethics and Innovation. We have people like the Ada Lovelace Institute focusing on these things. We have the Alan Turing Institute. We have, we hold at techUK an annual digital ethics summit, which is open to all. This year it's on the 9th of December. Come along. It'll be virtual, where we're having this conversation we have done for a number of years. Big we have a community, a big community that are really looking at how do we get this right for society as well. So I think, not to say, we're done ticking a box, because we'll never be done ticking a box. And I think that's a point as well about thinking how we take strategy forward, Phil, how we operationalize it, how do we keep it alive and keep it moving as well. I think as part of the consultation, that will be a big point that we will want to factor in, is not just how do we get going with this and how do we put it into action, and we're here to help with that, but how do we make sure we keep it relevant and keep it appropriate for how the data industry, the digital industry, and how data will be used in different ways, because this is the only direction travel that's going forward, right?
And I was thinking when you were talking about quality, Sue, and a conversation that I think was on an event that we were actually earlier today, which was ironically 2 data events in a day together, but taxonomy of data, this whole having a classification that is understood in core areas where we can affect the greatest change, prioritising, where could we start with focus on taxonomy? And what I mean by that is basically, making sure there is a common understanding of what we mean by something, a characteristic. It has a standardisation of language and understanding that when we pick that attribute and apply that to a model, that actually we're all looking at this data through the same understanding.
Yeah.
It's important. But where do we prioritise that? Where do we start? Because actually, if we're looking at the central government for frameworks, maybe there's something around taxonomy of data around health, maybe as a starting point, or even perhaps other aspects of you talked about the human lab